April 14th, 1945. 8 miles off the coast of Scotland. A German submarine prowled silently through the dark waters of the North Atlantic, 200 feet below the surface. It was one of the most advanced submarines in the Kriegsmarine fleet, equipped with the latest technology, armed with torpedoes and crewed by 50 men trained for one purpose: hunting Allied ships. And then the captain had to use the bathroom. 20 minutes later, that submarine would be on the surface, flooding with seawater and sewage, filling with poisonous chlorine gas, under attack by British aircraft, and sinking rapidly. The cause? A toilet. A high-tech, over-engineered German precision toilet that was supposed to represent the future of submarine sanitation. This is the story of WWII, the only warship in naval history sunk by its own malfunctioning toilet. This is the story of German engineering taken to absurd extremes. And this is the story of Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt, whose bathroom break became one of the most embarrassing military disasters of World War II. To understand how a toilet sank a submarine, you first need to understand what life was like aboard a German U-boat during World War II. Imagine being sealed inside a steel tube roughly 220 feet long and 20 feet wide, packed with 50 men, diesel engines, batteries, torpedoes, ammunition, food supplies, and fuel. Now imagine staying underwater for weeks at a time. No fresh air, no sunlight, no privacy, no escape. U-boats were technological marvels, the apex predators of naval warfare. The Type VIIC submarine, the class to which WWII belonged, was the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine's submarine fleet. Over 700 were built during the war. They displaced 769 tons on the surface, could dive to 750 feet, carried 14 torpedoes, and had a crew of 44 to 52 men, depending on the mission. They were also floating metal coffins. 75% of all German U-boats were sunk during the war. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat service, 30,000 died. That's a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. If you served on a U-boat, the odds were overwhelming that you would die in that U-boat. Depth charges would crush your hull. Allied destroyers would hunt you, aircraft would bomb you, or, in the case of WWII, your toilet would betray you. But before we get to the toilet, we need to understand just how unpleasant life aboard a U-boat really was. Living conditions were appalling. The interior was cramped beyond belief. There were no bunks for everyone. Men slept in shifts, sharing the same bunks. Hot bunking, they called it. You'd crawl into a bed that was still warm and damp from the sweat of the man who just vacated it. Personal space didn't exist. You were always within arm's reach of at least 3 other men. Privacy was impossible. Everything you did, everyone saw. Everything you said, everyone heard. After weeks underwater, tensions ran high. Fights broke out. Men snapped. Some went mad. The air was foul. German U-boats had notoriously inadequate ventilation systems. The air was thick with diesel fumes from the engines, body odor from 50 men who couldn't bathe, cooking smells from the galley, and the ever-present stench of human waste. Which brings us to the bathrooms. Or rather, the bathroom. Singular. Most Type VIIC U-boats had two toilets, called heads in naval terminology. But one of those toilets was usually located right next to the galley kitchen. When space was needed for food storage, and it always was, that toilet was blocked off and used as a pantry, which meant 50 men shared one toilet. One toilet for 50 men living in a sealed steel tube underwater for weeks at a time. Think about that. Now, think about what happens when that one toilet becomes unavailable. Because there was a problem. A big problem. The toilet only worked when the submarine was on or near the surface. German U-boats disposed of sewage by flushing it directly into the sea. Unlike Allied submarines, which stored waste in septic tanks until they could surface and pump it out. The German system saved weight and space, both critical in submarine design. But it had a fatal flaw. When the submarine was submerged, especially at depth, the water pressure outside the hull was immense. At 200 feet deep, the pressure is roughly 90 pounds per square inch. You can't flush a toilet against that kind of pressure. The seawater would just push back, flooding the toilet and potentially the entire compartment. So when the U-boat was submerged below periscope depth, the toilet was off limits, completely unavailable. If nature called, you couldn't use the bathroom. What did the crew do? They used buckets, tin cans, any container they could find. They would carefully, very carefully, relieve themselves into these containers, seal them, and store them somewhere in the already cramped submarine. Don't spill. Whatever you do, don't spill. They would store these containers, dozens of them, until the submarine surfaced. Then they could either pour the contents into the toilet and flush, or carry them topside and dump them overboard. Now imagine the smell. The submarine already reeked of diesel, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Add buckets and cans of human waste stored throughout the boat. The stench was indescribable. Veterans who survived U-boat service said you could smell a U-boat crew from 50 feet away on land. The smell soaked into their clothes, their skin, their hair. Some men vomited from the smell alone. Others became so desensitized that they stopped noticing. It was just part of life aboard a U-boat. You learned to live with it, or you didn't survive. This was the reality for every U-boat crew, for years, throughout the entire war. And German engineers, in their infinite wisdom, decided they could solve this problem with technology. In 1943, German naval engineers developed what they believed was a revolutionary new toilet system for submarines. It was called a deep-water, high-pressure toilet. The system was designed to allow submarines to flush waste even when submerged at depth. The concept was ingenious. Instead of simply flushing waste directly into the sea, which was impossible at depth because of water pressure, the new system used a series of chambers and airlocks. Here's how it worked, or rather, how it was supposed to work. When you used the toilet, the waste went into a special chamber. That chamber could be sealed off from both the toilet above and the ocean below. Once sealed, compressed air was pumped into the chamber, increasing the pressure inside until it exceeded the water pressure outside the submarine. Then, and only then, could you open the valve to the sea. The compressed air would blast the waste out of the submarine like a torpedo. A poop torpedo, if you will. Once the chamber was emptied, you'd close the valve to the sea, release the compressed air, and the chamber was ready for the next use. It was complicated. It required operating multiple valves in exactly the correct sequence. Open the wrong valve at the wrong time, and seawater would flood into the submarine. Close the wrong valve at the wrong time, and the system would jam. Mess up the sequence, and bad things would happen. Very bad things. The system was so complicated that each U-boat equipped with the new toilet was assigned a specialist, a toilet technician. His job was to operate the toilet system and train crew members on proper flushing procedures. Yes, the German Navy had official toilet technicians, men who were specially trained in the art of high-pressure underwater defecation disposal. It sounds like a joke. It wasn't. It was absolutely necessary because the system was so complex that untrained personnel could easily cause a disaster. And that's exactly what happened aboard U-1206. U-1206 was ordered on April 2, 1942, and laid down on June 12, 1943, at the F. Schickau shipyard in Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland. It was a Type VIIC submarine, standard design, but fitted with the new high-pressure toilet system. The submarine was launched on December 30, 1943, and commissioned into service on March 16, 1944. It was assigned to the 8th U-boat flotilla for training and working up. Command was given to Kapitän Leutnant Karl Adolf Schlitt. He was 27 years old, young for a U-boat commander, but not unusually so. By 1944, Germany was running out of experienced submarine officers. The casualty rate was staggering. Young men were being promoted rapidly to fill the gaps left by the dead. Schlitt trained with his crew throughout 1944. They practiced diving, they practiced surfacing, they practiced torpedo drills, they practiced emergency procedures. They learned how every system on the boat worked, except, apparently, the toilet. In early 1945, U-1206 was transferred to the 11th U-boat flotilla and sent on training patrols in the North Sea. These were the final shakedown cruises before the submarine would be sent on actual combat patrol. By April 1945, the war situation for Germany was desperate. The Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of Berlin. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe was destroyed. The Wehrmacht was shattered. But the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine was still fighting. There were still submarines at sea, still hunting Allied shipping, still trying to disrupt the supply lines that were feeding the Allied advance. On April 6, 1945, U-1206 departed from Kristiansand, Norway, on its first combat patrol. The mission was straightforward. Sail to the waters off Scotland, hunt for Allied merchant ships and naval vessels, sink everything you can, avoid being sunk yourself. It was U-1206's first combat mission. The crew was nervous. The captain was nervous, but they were trained. They were ready. They were in one of the most advanced submarines Germany had ever built. For 8 days, everything went perfectly. They sailed northwest from Norway, submerged during the day to avoid Allied aircraft, surfaced at night to charge batteries and ventilate the boat. They reached their patrol area off the coast of Scotland. They scanned for targets. And then, on April 14, 1945, Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt had to use the bathroom. It was around midday. WWII was cruising at 200 feet depth, about 8 nautical miles off Peterhead, Scotland. The submarine was running silent, listening for Allied ships on sonar, staying deep to avoid detection. Captain Schlitt felt the call of nature. He made his way to the head, one of the 2 toilets aboard, the one that was actually functioning as a toilet and not a food storage locker. He used the toilet, and then he tried to flush it. Now, accounts of what happened next vary. Some say Schlitt called the toilet technician immediately and asked for help. Others say Schlitt tried to operate the system himself first, following the procedures he'd been trained on, and only called for help when something went wrong. Either way, the sequence of events is clear. Someone opened the wrong valve, and disaster followed. Instead of compressed air blasting waste out of the submarine, seawater blasted into the submarine. Gallons of seawater. And along with it came everything that had been in the toilet chamber. Human waste mixed with seawater came flooding into the bathroom compartment. Schlitt and the toilet technician frantically tried to close the valves, tried to stop the flow, tried to figure out what had gone wrong, but the damage was done. Water and sewage were flooding the compartment, and it got worse. Much worse. The bathroom on WWII was located directly above the battery compartment. German U-boats, like all submarines, ran on battery power when submerged. The batteries were massive, banks of lead-acid cells that powered the electric motors that turned the propellers. These batteries were located in the lowest part of the submarine, beneath the deck plates in sealed compartments. Except the compartment wasn't entirely sealed. There were hatches, ventilation ducts, cable runs, pipe penetrations, and now seawater and sewage were flooding down through all those openings into the battery compartment. When seawater contacts lead-acid batteries, a chemical reaction occurs. The salt water reacts with the sulfuric acid in the batteries, producing chlorine gas. Chlorine gas is lethal. It was used as a chemical weapon in World War I, killing thousands of soldiers in the trenches. It burns the lungs, causes choking, leads to suffocation. A high enough concentration will kill you in minutes. And it was now being generated in large quantities inside WWII. Crew members in the after section of the boat started coughing. Their eyes watered. Their throats burned. Alarms started sounding. Men grabbed emergency breathing apparatus. The boat was filling with poison gas. Captain Schlitt faced an impossible choice. He could stay submerged and hope they could contain the flooding, vent the gas, and somehow fix the problem. But the gas was spreading. Men were already getting sick. If the concentration got high enough, his entire crew would die. Or he could surface, blow the ballast tanks, get the submarine to the surface, open the hatches, get fresh air into the boat, save his crew. But surfacing 8 miles off the coast of Scotland in broad daylight, in waters heavily patrolled by the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, was suicidal. The moment they broke the surface, they'd be visible. Allied radar would detect them. Ships and planes would converge on their position. Schlitt had seconds to decide. Stay down and die from gas. Surface and probably die from enemy action. He chose to surface. At least that gave them a chance. Blow all tanks. Emergency surface. Full rise on the planes. Get us up now. The submarine angled sharply upward. Compressed air roared into the ballast tanks, forcing water out, making the boat buoyant. U-1206 shot toward the surface like a cork released from the bottom of a pool. They broke the surface at approximately 1400 hours, 8 miles off Peterhead on the Aberdeenshire coast of Scotland. The hatches were thrown open, fresh air flooded in. Crew members stumbled out onto the deck, coughing, gasping, trying to clear their lungs of the chlorine gas. For a brief moment, they had survived. They were on the surface, they were breathing, they were alive. And then the Royal Air Force arrived. British coastal radar had detected the surfacing submarine immediately. An alert went out. Enemy submarine on the surface, coordinates provided, all available aircraft respond. A patrol aircraft. Accounts differ on whether it was a short Sunderland flying boat or a Vickers Warwick from RAF Coastal Command. Spotted U-1206 within minutes. The submarine was wallowing on the surface, clearly in distress, men visible on the deck. The aircraft attacked. Bombs fell. Machine guns opened fire. Explosions walked across the water toward the helpless submarine. The crew scrambled for cover. Some manned the anti-aircraft guns and tried to fight back. Others just tried to survive. One bomb hit very close enough that the explosion caused serious damage to the submarine's hull. Water started flooding in through new cracks and openings. The diesel engines wouldn't start. The boat was taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. Captain Schlitt realized the situation was hopeless. His submarine was flooding. The batteries were contaminated with seawater. The diesel engines were damaged. They couldn't dive. They couldn't run on the surface. They were sitting ducks. He gave the order. Abandon ship. The crew scrambled to launch the life rafts and dinghies stored on deck. They threw supplies overboard. Men jumped into the freezing water of the North Atlantic. The water temperature was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Without survival suits, hypothermia would set in within 30 minutes. Before abandoning the submarine himself, Schlitt gathered all classified documents, code books, and secret materials. He weighted them down and threw them overboard, ensuring they would sink and not fall into enemy hands. Then he set demolition charges to scuttle the boat, to ensure the British couldn't capture it intact and learn its secrets. He was the last man off U-1206, following the ancient naval tradition that the captain goes down with his ship, or in this case, leaves last. The crew clustered in life rafts and clung to wreckage, watching their submarine sink beneath the waves. Some men were injured from the bombing. All were exhausted, terrified, in shock. Of the 50 men who had been aboard U-1206 that morning, 4 died that afternoon. 3 drowned, either during the British attack or while abandoning ship in the rough seas. 1 had died the previous day from illness, unrelated to the toilet disaster. The remaining 46 men floated in the North Atlantic, waiting to be rescued or to die from hypothermia. Small boats from the Scottish coast, fishing vessels and local patrol craft reached the survivors first. They pulled the Germans from the water, wrapped them in blankets, gave them hot tea. The men were prisoners of war now, but at least they were alive and safe. 10 survivors made it to shore in their life rafts and were captured by Scottish Home Guard troops. The other 36 were picked up by rescue vessels and taken to shore. Captain Schlitt and his crew spent the remaining few weeks of the war in British POW camps. It was April 14th, 1945. Adolf Hitler would commit suicide in his bunker on April 30th, just 16 days later. Germany would surrender on May 7th, less than a month after U-1206 sank. The crew of U-1206 had survived the toilet disaster, survived the bombing, survived the North Atlantic, and would survive the war. Given the 75% casualty rate for U-boat crews, they were extraordinarily lucky. Their toilet malfunction, embarrassing as it was, had probably saved their lives. If U-1206 had continued its patrol, if the toilet had worked perfectly, the submarine would have stayed at sea for weeks more. And during those weeks, Allied anti-submarine forces would have hunted it. The odds of survival for a U-boat operating in April 1945 were abysmal. The Allies had perfected their anti-submarine tactics. They had sonar, radar, depth charges, homing torpedoes, aircraft with searchlights and bombs. U-boats were being sunk at a horrific rate. Most patrols ended with the submarine destroyed and all hands lost. The toilet disaster, humiliating though it was, likely saved 46 lives. When news of the sinking reached British intelligence, they were initially baffled. Reports said a German submarine had surfaced for no apparent reason, was attacked and sunk. Why would a U-boat surface in daylight in heavily patrolled waters? Then they interviewed the captured crew, and the story came out. The toilet, the flooding, the chlorine gas, the emergency surface. The British called it the shipwreck. It became an instant legend. A German submarine, one of the most feared weapons of the war, sunk by its own toilet. The story was too good not to share. British intelligence compiled a detailed report on the incident. The report noted, with barely concealed amusement, that German engineering had created a toilet so complex that it required a specialist to operate, and that even with a specialist aboard, the system had failed catastrophically. The report concluded that British and American submarines, with their simpler septic tank systems, were far more reliable. Yes, they had to surface periodically to pump out waste. Yes, they sacrificed some interior space for the tanks. But they didn't flood with seawater and sewage. They didn't generate poisonous gas. And they didn't sink themselves. Sometimes, simpler is better. U-1206 came to rest on the bottom of the North Sea, about 12 miles off Cruden Bay in Aberdeenshire, at a depth of approximately 230 feet. It lay there, forgotten, for decades. In the 1970s, workers laying the BP-40's field oil pipeline from the North Sea to the Scottish coast detected something on the seabed. Sonar showed a large metal object. Divers were sent down to investigate. It was U-1206, remarkably well preserved, considering it had been underwater for over 30 years. The cold, dark waters of the North Sea had prevented most corrosion. The submarine was still largely intact. In May 2012, a team of technical divers explored the wreck more thoroughly. They reported that U-1206 was in very good condition despite lying on the seabed for 67 years. The conning tower was still standing. The hull was intact. You could still see the torpedo tubes, the deck gun, the anti-aircraft guns. It's a war grave now. 4 men died when the submarine sank, out of respect. The exact location is not publicly disclosed, and diving on the wreck is discouraged. But the story lives on. U-1206 has become one of the most famous submarine wrecks in the world, not because of any great battles it fought, but because of how it sank. Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt survived the war as a prisoner of the British. He was released after Germany's surrender and returned home. He lived a quiet life after the war. He never spoke publicly about the toilet incident. In fact, he denied it for the rest of his life. When historians and journalists tracked him down decades later and asked about the famous toilet disaster, Schlitt insisted it never happened. He claimed the submarine was damaged by depth charges. He said the toilet story was British propaganda, but the records are clear. The British interrogation reports from the captured crew, the German naval records, the accounts from multiple crew members, all confirm the toilet disaster. Schlitt died in 2009 at the age of 90. He took his embarrassment to the grave, never admitting publicly that his bathroom break sank a submarine. It's hard to blame him. Imagine being remembered forever as the captain who sank his own submarine with a toilet. Imagine that being your legacy, not your years of service, not your training, not your survival, just the toilet. The story of U-1206 is funny. There's no denying that. A toilet sinking a submarine is inherently absurd. It sounds like something from a comedy movie, not real life. When people hear the story, they laugh. It's been featured in dozens of books, documentaries, articles, and websites. It's become a legend of military mishaps. But beneath the humor is a tragedy. 4 men died. 46 others spent the final weeks of the war in POW camps. A sophisticated piece of machinery, costing millions of Reichsmarks and thousands of hours of labor to build, was lost. And it was all preventable. If the toilet system had been simpler, if the training had been better, if the captain had called for the specialist immediately instead of trying to operate it himself, assuming that's what happened. If any one of a dozen things had gone differently, U-1206 might have completed its patrol and returned to base. The disaster also highlights a fundamental problem with over-engineering. German military equipment during World War II was often incredibly sophisticated. Tiger tanks, V-2 rockets, jet aircraft. The Germans were technological innovators, but sophisticated doesn't always mean better. The Tiger tank was superior to the American Sherman in almost every way, but it broke down constantly and was impossible to repair in the field. The V-2 rocket was a technological marvel, but it cost more than a bomber and was less accurate. German jet aircraft were faster than anything the Allies had, but they required special fuel, broke down frequently, and were vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The German high-pressure toilet was the same. Yes, it allowed submarines to flush at depth. That was an improvement over the bucket method. But it was so complicated that it required a specialist to operate. And when it malfunctioned, it could sink the entire submarine. Allied submarines used simple septic tanks, crude, basic, but they worked. They never flooded with seawater. They never generated poisonous gas. And they never sank their own submarine. The lesson is clear. Sometimes the simple solution is the best solution, especially in war, where equipment needs to be reliable, maintainable, and operable by ordinary soldiers under stress. U-1206 could have been an extremely effective submarine. It was well built, well armed, crewed by trained men. It could have sunk Allied ships, disrupted supply lines, and made a real contribution to the German war effort. Instead, it's remembered as the submarine that was sunk by its own toilet. It survived 8 days on patrol before being defeated by German engineering hubris. Today, U-1206 rests on the bottom of the North Sea, a tomb for 4 men and a monument to the law of unintended consequences. German engineers tried to solve a real problem, the difficulty of operating toilets on submerged submarines. They developed an ingenious solution, and that solution destroyed one of their submarines. The wreck sits there in the cold, dark water as a reminder that in war, as in life, sometimes the simplest problems have the most catastrophic consequences. A toilet malfunction, that's all it took. Not a depth charge attack, not a torpedo hit, not a mine strike, not a brilliant tactical move by Allied forces. Just a toilet that didn't work the way it was supposed to, operated by someone who made a mistake, leading to a chain of events that ended with a submarine on the bottom of the sea and 4 men dead. The crew of U-1206 did everything right. They trained hard, they followed orders, they went to war for their country, and they were defeated by plumbing. It's absurd, it's tragic, it's human, and it's a perfect example of how war, for all its grand strategies and sophisticated technology, often comes down to small moments. A wrong valve opened, a mistake made, a disaster that unfolds in minutes. War historians study the great battles, the turning points, the brilliant strategies and catastrophic blunders made by generals and admirals. They analyze the big picture, the sweep of history, the clash of armies and ideologies. But war is also made up of thousands of small moments. A soldier who takes one more step and triggers a mine. A pilot who turns left instead of right and flies into a cliff. A submarine captain who uses the bathroom and accidentally floods his boat. U-1206 reminds us that war isn't just about the grand narrative. It's also about the individual experiences, the small decisions that have large consequences, the moments of human error that change everything. Captain Schlitt made a mistake, or someone under his command made a mistake. Or maybe the system was just badly designed and failure was inevitable. Either way, that mistake sent a submarine to the bottom of the ocean. He survived. Most of his crew survived. They were fortunate. But 4 men died that day, and a sophisticated warship was lost, all because of a toilet. In the end, that's the legacy of U-1206, not the sophisticated technology, not the brave crew, not the training or the tactics or the strategic situation, just the toilet, the infamous toilet. The toilet that sank a U-boat. It's one of the most famous toilets in military history. It has its own Wikipedia page. It's been featured in documentaries on the History Channel and the Military Channel. It's been written about in dozens of books about World War II. Tourists visit the area off Cruden Bay and look out at the sea, knowing that somewhere beneath those waves lies U-1206, sunk by its own toilet. Divers who have explored the wreck report that the submarine is remarkably well preserved. The toilet, presumably, is still down there, 70 feet below the surface, the instrument of the submarine's destruction. The story has endured for 80 years because it's so perfectly absurd. In a war filled with tragedy, horror, and death, The story of the toilet that sank a submarine provides a moment of dark humor. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there are moments of farce. War is often portrayed as heroic, dramatic, meaningful, and sometimes it is. But sometimes, war is just ridiculous. Sometimes, submarines sink themselves with toilets. Sometimes, the most sophisticated military equipment is defeated by the simplest mistake. That's the real legacy of WWII, not a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-engineering, though it is that. Not a tragic story of 4 men who died needlessly, though it is that too. The real legacy is a reminder that history is made by human beings, and human beings make mistakes. Even trained professionals, even experienced commanders, even in the middle of a war where every decision matters. Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt went to the bathroom. Someone opened the wrong valve. A submarine sank. It's that simple, it's that complicated, it's that human. And 80 years later, we're still talking about it. The toilet that sank a U-boat, the shipwreck, the most embarrassing naval disaster of World War II. WWII lies on the bottom of the North Sea, a monument to human fallibility, German over-engineering, and the fundamental truth that sometimes history is determined by the smallest, most ridiculous things. Like a toilet.